From time to time, we have to reevaluate things we know. We have to stand maybe in a different place to look at them. We may shine the light on them from a different angle, to look into cracks or crevices or things that we may have, from where we were sitting before, never even realized were there. Some people never do this. They take one position, they look at things the way they do always, they shine one light on it, and it's good enough for, as they say about the King James Version, if it was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. I have found it useless, really, to try to argue with people who are of that frame of mind. It's about as useful as trying to argue with the Iraqi information minister about who has control of the Baghdad airport. It's important to realize, though, that while the object we are looking at may not change, we can see it differently if we look at it more carefully from a different angle, shine the light on it differently, and hopefully more clearly from time to time. For a very long time now, I have insisted that if we're going to understand prophecy, we have to understand the history of that prophecy. We have to understand the time in which it was given, the time frame in which it fell. We have to look at the reaction and the interaction between God and man. We need to understand somehow, as well as we can, the circumstances and apply them so that we will understand what's coming down. Every incursion I make into the Scriptures bears this out. It was Isaiah who really helped me first to understand this, and it was a long time ago when I came to see this. I was riding in a car with some students, and it was an axiom among us at that time that prophecy is dual. And some student, smart guy that he was, said, "How do we know that?" And the students kicked it around for a while, and finally one of them says, "Well, I think we must have to take it on faith." And that was good enough for nearly everyone in the car, so we kept on driving, and the subject went away. It wasn't good enough for me, however, because I really wanted to know, is prophecy dual? How do we know that prophecy is dual? And it was that search that led me to Isaiah chapter 41, verse 21. It's just a short passage. "Produce your cause, says the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what shall happen. Let them show the former things what they be, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come." Show us the former things so we can consider them and understand the latter end of them. Now, if you think about this, that's only common sense. That in order to understand what a prophet is trying to say, you need to understand as far as you possibly can the circumstances under which it was said and the background of it. And it's not easy. I take this very seriously. I think too many try to explain prophecy with no reference whatsoever to its historical context. They take a chapter out of context. They take its symbols and its events, and they say, well, a mountain means this, and a lion means this, and the symbolism. They try to interpret the prophecy that way by events and symbols elsewhere. There's nothing particularly wrong with this as far as it goes. The problem with it is that too often you end up with a private interpretation with no real understanding of what's actually going on, why it's happening, what it tells us about God, what it tells us about man, and what it might tell us about our own interaction with God here these many generations later. This came home with a rush to me this last week, because I was doing a radio program on the prophet Jeremiah, and I came to a particular chapter in which there was a letter. I'd read this before, it was all there, but somehow or other it just hit me this week. Jeremiah wrote a letter, and the letter is recorded in the 29th chapter. We're not there yet, but we'll go to that 29th chapter in a moment. I was doing the radio program, and I began to realize there's an awful lot of stuff between the lines in Scripture that is very easy for us to overlook. So I hope you'll bear with me today. I want to try to lay a little groundwork for something I think which will open your understanding or shine some light on something in a way that you haven't seen it before. In about 640 B.C., a king named Josiah ascended to the throne of Judah. Israel had its ups and downs, a lot of downs, a few ups. And Josiah was one of the ups. In 2 Kings 22, it tells us about the ascension of Josiah to the throne. 2 Kings 22, verse 1. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidiah, the daughter of Adiah of Bosketh. That's really, I think, an important thing when you understand. He was 8 years old when he ascended to the throne. And the Bible takes pains to tell us who his mother was. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that an 8-year-old king's mother is going to be a profound influence on the things that are going to be coming to pass later on. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of David his father, and did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. He was a good man. It was Josiah who ordered a restoration of the temple. And in the process of it, they found the book of the law there, and they suddenly woke up, with one of these head-slapping experiences and said, look here, there's a Passover, and we haven't been doing it, and God's going to be terribly angry with us. And they began to keep the Passover as they had not done so for generations in Israel as a result of the reforms of one Jeremiah. It was Josiah who restored the proper worship of God, according to the book, and who cleaned out the idol worship and moved the idols out of the very temple of God and shut down the houses of the Sodomites that were around the temple of God. Jeremiah actually begins his work in the reign of Josiah. 31 years later, he was killed in battle in Megiddo, of all places. Megiddo, by the way, is the place of Armageddon. That's the place where King Josiah died at the age of 39. It was 609 BC, and really the beginning of the end for the house of Judah. And I'd like to bring you forward now to 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 29 to kind of look at the context of some aspects of Jeremiah's prophecy that will be important to us to understand this letter as we come to the letter and read it. In this world at this time, things were rather different from anything you and I have any familiarity at all. In fact, if you went to a third world country today, you'd know, of course, you were in a different culture. You'd be shocked out of your world if you tried to live from day to day in one of these third world countries. You would wonder how in the world people down there ever make it in those places. But the fact of the matter is that even in those third world countries, a lot of people live better than most people did in the times when Jeremiah, Josiah, all these people were doing their thing in Jerusalem. You have moved into a different country, a different time, a different culture, where people didn't look at things like you and I do. They didn't respond to things like you and I do. Now, a couple of things are the same through all this. Human nature is the same. God's nature is the same. But not much else is, as a matter of fact. And the circumstances of people and political, goings-on were totally different. For one thing, there were no nations as you and I know nations in these days. There were city-states which exercised hegemony over the region around about this city-state. The city would have walls around it for its defense, and whenever an enemy attacker came into the area, the people from the countryside around would retreat into the city, bring their food, bring their stuff, and they would settle in, hopefully having enough food and water to endure a siege from an invading army that's passing through their land. What tended to happen in most cases in the ancient world is everybody did a pretty quick analysis. Can we do this, or can we resist, or can we not? And if they decided they couldn't resist or couldn't hold out, they cut a deal. And this was the whole object of the exercise in most of these cases. Alexander the Great, when he went through this part of the world, a lot of times did not have to actually defeat anybody or kill anybody, that he actually cut deals with the city. And then having cut the deal, went on. And this was the way stuff was done, and depending upon how strong your city was, you could establish your hegemony over villages, over other cities, other towns. You could collect taxes from these people, which also helped to pay your expenses in maintaining your standing army, which then protected all these cities that were in your hegemony from an empire over yonder, which was going to try to come in and encroach on the territory that you held sway over. Again, these were not nations with well-defined boundaries. They were centers of power, cities that exercised influence over a sphere immediately around the city, a little less influence further out. And of course, if you've got somebody way out there who started to refuse to pay their taxes, well, you sent the army out there, and if necessary, you sacked the city and took the money from them or whatever it was, and did whatever needed to be done to be a lesson to all the other cities round about so everybody would pay their taxes. It's just a different world. Sort of like the IRS, but maybe not quite as, I started to say not quite as kind, but maybe that's not the word I want to use in this context. So the world was different. Now, we are in foreign territory and foreign times, and that brings us to 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 29. In his days, that's Josiah's days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up against the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, And King Josiah went against him, and he slew him at Megiddo when he spotted him there. His servants carried him in a chariot, dead, from Megiddo, and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's stead. A routine course of the change of the government of a town. But notice what's going on. You have the king of Assyria in the north, you have the Pharaoh in the south, and these two huge kingdoms are not going to allow little Jerusalem in between them to be neutral. You're going to have to decide, I'm going to fight with Pharaoh or I'm going to fight with Syria. We're not going to be allowed to stay neutral in this battle. I'm not exactly clear what Josiah did. Whatever it was, it ended his life. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, a different Jeremiah. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father has done. Okay, not a good guy. Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so he would not reign in Jerusalem anymore, and he put the land to tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Probably find you a Bible dictionary that will tell you what those numbers would be in today's dollars, but it will still be meaningless to you in terms of the actual effect on the people at the time under those circumstances in those places. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah his father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, also known as Jeconiah. Now, just a slight sidelight here. Jeconiah and Jehoiakim are the same thing. Jehoiakim and Jeconiah mean precisely the same thing in Hebrew. They are different phonetic sounds, but they're the same person. I presume that they made the change from Jeconiah to Jehoiakim when he became king. It was more of a royal-sounding word or name for him, but it still meant the same thing. He took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. Now, in this particular case, Egypt is exercising its hegemony over Jerusalem. Egypt is the dominant power in the south. They're up there. They collect taxes from Jerusalem. Their army is there to try to fight against the Assyrians or anybody else who's going to be involving himself. Problem with this is that over time, another power rises up, Egypt is becoming weaker, and the balance of power in this part of the world begins to change. Now, I know it's a little bit of a complicated thing, but it's not terribly difficult to understand if you just understand the ebb and flow of nations at this time without clearly defined boundaries and with the balance of power depending upon who had the money, who had the soldiers, who had the training, who could fight, who was stronger, who was not. And so they exercised their power back and forth, and Jerusalem got caught in the middle a lot more often probably than they really would have liked to have caught. Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh. He taxed the land to give money according to the commandment of Pharaoh. He extracted the silver and gold out of the people of the land, every one according to his taxation, to give to Pharaoh Necho. No, big deal. They go around, collect the taxes, and send them off. It's like around here. They collect the taxes and send them off to the federal government. I mail mine down to Austin, but they go off to Washington, and whatever happens with them there, God only knows. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebudah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Ramah. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all the stuff his fathers had done. And this is really a sad time in Israel, because as the government begins to decay at the top, the decay begins to affect the lives of ordinary people. If you're off living in the countryside, you've got a vineyard out there, and you've got a few acres in which you grow some vegetables, you grow your fruit, you make wine, you bring the wine into town, you sell the wine, you buy some clothes, you buy some whatever it is you want, you get some cloth to make clothes with, and you go home, and you have your wife and your kids around you, you build a house, you just live your life out in the countryside. The problem is that as things began to go bad in the city, they began to go bad in the countryside. And all throughout Judah, the common people, the ordinary people, the little people, if we have to call them that, their lives were getting worse and worse because of the corruption of the administration that was in Jerusalem at this time. It's difficult to look back and understand how that was. But people today who are poor, in some cases, live better than King David did in his palace in those days. King David had no air conditioning, for example, among other things. He may have eaten as well as any of us do because he was the king. But, as far as comforts and all the stuff that we've got, no. It was a hard time. It was a hard place. Life was hard for everybody on the planet. in those days. It was different. And so consequently, though, the life of the people, having not been all that wonderful to begin with, at least it was a life, and at least they could live their lives, began to get worse because of the failures of leadership at the top. In his days, chapter 24, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Now, as I said, the power has shifted. Babylon has become more powerful and has defeated Egypt. Now Babylon's collecting taxes from Jerusalem. Now, in one sense of the word, this is not a terribly big deal. You know, the question is, are we going to maintain a standing army, defend our city, go to all this trouble and spend all this money, or are we going to pay taxes to the king of Babylon and let him do it? And basically, this is what the situation amounted to. It was tribute. It probably was bad. I'm sure it was burdensome at times, but it was a whole lot less burdensome than having the city surrounded by Babylonians and having to, put up with being besieged. So they paid their taxes to Babylon. However, at the end, he became his servant for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him. Now, what was the source of this rebellion? Hard to say, because it certainly couldn't have been the quality of life for Jehoiakim. You think about that. You know, as hard and as difficult as life can be in some of these third world countries, it is not very difficult for the people at the top. They eat their meals. They have people taking care of them. They can have a Nubian slave fanning them so they don't get too hot. They can have everything that they want at the top. So now what's going on here? Well, if human nature has not changed, and it has not, then I would have to kind of assume that what's going on is a power play. It's a question of power, of influence, and extending of the power and influence. But Jehoiakim decided he didn't want to pay the taxes and decided to rebel. The Lord sent against him the bands of the Chaldeans, Syrians, Moabites, Ammonites, and sent them against Judah to destroy them. Okay, here comes the whole bunch of them, Chaldeans, but he picks up, interestingly enough, all of the lands in between Babylon and Judea to come in and fight. So like I said before, if you're in the lands of Pharaoh and Pharaoh decides he's going to go against the Assyrians, you better get your army together and go with him, because that's what we're going to do. And here's the case where Babylonians decide they're going to fight Jerusalem, and they pick up Moab, Ammon, all these people in between, and here they come. They came to destroy it. Surely at the commandment of the Lord this came upon Judah, to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh. Now we're going all the way back to an earlier king, but he says it's bad. It started back there, and God says, I have not forgotten it. He said, and also for the innocent blood that he shed, for he filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. Now, you look back down through history, and if you read the prophets, you try to ask yourself, what was it that got God really ticked off at these people? What was it that really angered God? What was the cause whereby he became so furious with them in the things that they did? Now, if you will take time and read your way through the prophets and keep noting all the stuff, the complaints that he registers against king after king, against, city after city, and against time after time, the people and what they have done, you will find a set of common things that come up. You will find references to the Sabbath, neglect of the Sabbath, and the holy days. But what you will come to realize as you read is that the neglect of the proper worship of God, the neglect of the form of the worship of God, opened the door for a lot of other stuff to come in. And far more of what the prophets have to say about the people of the time and what they did wrong and why God's anger came down upon them was not just that. It had to do with the shedding of innocent blood. One of the things that God says, and it's elsewhere, and you find it in the law, he says whenever somebody has killed somebody, a man slays somebody by the sword must his life be taken, in order to avenge the innocent blood and not defile the land with innocent blood. Innocent blood, people who are killed who are innocent and not avenged, defiles the land under your feet, according to God. And that defiling of the land is something which he says he will not pardon. Now, what was happening, and it wasn't just the king himself. It wasn't just Jehoiakim. It was the whole country that had become violent. And so consequently, as you begin to read your way through a lot of this stuff, you realize that the people were no longer safe in the streets, that they weren't safe in their homes, that they weren't safe out on their farms. They weren't safe anywhere. They could be killed. They could have their stuff taken away from them. They could have a member of their family killed. And if they make an accusation against the person who actually did it, you go into court. The court lets him off. And so it is that the innocent blood stays there, staining the land under your feet. Now, the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiakim, his son, otherwise known as Jeconiah, reigned in his stead. The king of Egypt came not any more out of his land. The king of Babylon had taken from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates everything that pertained to it. He didn't even bother going out to battle anymore. He stayed on his side of the Nile. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began to reign. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. Not a very successful reign, I would say. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. Like father, like son, chip off the old block, pick your cliche. We've got another one right here. At that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city and his servants and did besiege it. Now, it may be, I don't know how familiar you are with biblical history, but there's a tendency for the superficial reader to think there was only one captivity, that they came over and took everybody captive. Actually, there were 3. The Assyrians came in and took the northern tribes captive and carried them off away and scattered them among the nations. Now, there is this captivity where Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes Jeconiah and his people captive. But there then will be another captivity, the final one on Zedekiah, that we will come to in a few minutes. So keeping in mind the sequence of events, it's a long time from the time that Israel was gone. Israel is long since gone, the 10 northern tribes are, when all this is beginning to take place. The Assyrian kingdom has been gone into total eclipse. They were taken over by Babylon, and they themselves were made captive. They themselves were scattered. And so they're gone. Not only are the Israelites who they carried captive gone, the Assyrians are gone. The time is going to come when the Babylonians will be gone. It's just one after another. And so on. But anyway, Jehoiakim the king went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants, his princes and his officers, and the king of Babylon took him in the 8th year of his reign. He just took him. He took him and a few others as well. He carried out of there the treasures of the house of the Lord, all the treasures of the king's house. He cut in pieces all the vessels of gold that Solomon, the king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as he had said. All the gold, took it all, cut it in pieces, and carried it off with him. And he carried away all Jerusalem, all the princes, all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, all the craftsmen, the smiths. Nobody stayed except the poorest sort of the people of the land. Now, I don't know what he means by that, of the poorest sort of the people of the land. But I do know one thing. He took everybody out of there who amounted to anything and left the dregs. That's basically what he's telling us here. Now, among these people that he carried away captive are some names that will be familiar to you. Was it Hananiah, Mishael, and I forget the third name now of the 3 children, Hebrew children, who were thrown into the fire furnace, whom you know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were in that group. Daniel was in that group. Ezekiel was in that group. All these people were picked up out of Jerusalem and carried off to Babylon. Now, Jeremiah, though, was not. Jeremiah is still in town. Jeremiah is still going down to the city courthouse steps and talking to people about what's going on, why it's going on, preaching to the people about the events that have been taking place here. But all these people are gone out of the land. He carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, his officers, the mighty of the land. Everybody was gone. The men of might, 7,000, craftsmen and smiths, 1,000, all that were strong and apt to war. Even the king of Babylon took captive to Babylon. He didn't leave anybody behind who could even fight, which, from his perspective, was smart. He also, however, didn't leave Jerusalem any economy, which would amount to anything. So I don't know where he thought the taxes were going to come through from, but maybe that didn't bother him. The king of Babylon made Mattaniah, his father's brother, king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. And Zedekiah will be the last king Judah knows in this time. He was 21 when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutai, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, until he had cast them out of his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Now here's a man who doesn't have anything, that has no economy, has no power to gain much in the way of taxes if he even does get them. But he still does not have the brain power to say, I really need to keep working for the king of Babylon. You really wonder about people sometimes. Of course, we weren't there, we don't know what was going on, and we also don't know once the moral rot sets in among people, any wisdom is gone. And here is what is going to amount to a power play that plays very largely in the writings of Jeremiah. You will see all kinds of references to it as you read through the prophet Jeremiah. Now, there is great danger in this rebellion that is going on here. Great danger. In the prophecies of Jeremiah, we have a picture of a nation that is in decline. You have it all the way from the first of his prophecies, which were made back in the days of Josiah, when even though Josiah was reforming religion at the center of Jerusalem, the people still hadn't changed very much outside of the city. Things were still going on. People were still worshiping other gods. People were still doing the same things they were doing before. Things were better, but they were not truly reformed even then. In the years that followed, he still began to talk. Jeremiah did, about their problems. Israel has become increasingly violent and oppressive. They have adopted the religious practices of the Canaanites around them, when the only way you can possibly describe them is absolutely detestable. I wouldn't even want to speak of the things these people did in secret. People were not safe in the streets. They couldn't find justice in the courts. The leadership was corrupt from the top to the bottom, both the religious leadership and the secular leadership. Judges took bribes. Priests were adulterers. Prophets were liars. And so on it went. It's true to say, as I said, that Israel had left off the Sabbath and the holy days, and the prophets deal with that. But these things were only the initial step in a decline that became increasingly depraved. And when you read the prophets, you find just as much said about what are actually failures of government. Failures to protect the people, to do the fundamental things that governments are supposed to do. And that's to see to it that we are safe in our homes, safe in our jobs, that we can live our lives free from poverty, free from want, if we are willing to work for that. What is it? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the job of government, is to protect our right to do that. Well, the government of Israel wasn't doing that. Had done it quit a long time ago. Violence, murder, shedding of innocent blood, thieves who took advantage of the weak, judges that took bribe and let criminals go free. All this was a daily fact of life in Jerusalem. Now, I want to give you a rough sequence of the options God gave to these people through the prophets, primarily Jeremiah, more or less in time order of what the options were given. Very early in Jeremiah's prophecies, what you hear from him to the people is, repent, straighten up, and do right, and you can continue to dwell in this land. He tells them all the stuff they're doing wrong. He says, but what you've got to do is you've got to protect the weak. You've got to judge the fatherless. You've got to plead for the widow. You've got to take care of people. You've got to you've got to live right. If you'll just do this, he says, you can stay in the land. Time passes. Finally, he says, no, that won't work anymore. Now, what you're going to have to do is surrender to the Babylonians, knuckle under, accept their hegemony, pay their taxes, and you can live your life and live in the land. Time passes. They wouldn't do that. Now they are given the next option. It is go into captivity in Babylon or die. As simple as that. Things have gone so far. It's not going to work anymore. You're not going to be able to stay in this land anymore, because this land has become corrupt. It is defiled with innocent blood. It's just no place I want my people to be anymore. So go into Babylon in captivity. And the final option, stay in the city and die. That was it. Their options slowly closed around them over time. And you can kind of understand why it would be so. It's not just a mean-spirited God who's mad at them because of their offending him. It's because of the way in which they have slowly led their country into deeper and deeper decay and rot, to the place that there is no place clean to set your foot anymore in the land, that the time will come that God will just take them out of the land because they're not safe there anymore. It's an interesting way of looking at this that as I said, I had not quite understood in the way that I'm beginning to understand it at this time. If they couldn't govern themselves, which was increasingly beginning to be the case, God would bring in a foreign government. Babylonian government was better than the government that they had. It was that simple. Under Babylonian rule and administration, they could be safer than they would be under their own rule and administration. Now I want you to turn back with me to the 29th chapter of Jeremiah. And it's here I want you to stand over on one side and shine the light into this at a different angle from what you might have looked at this captivity of Israel before. Jeremiah sits down and pens a letter. Jeremiah 29, verse 1. These are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the residue of the elders who were carried away captive, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now you have the picture. Jeremiah's in Jerusalem, but there's a whole passel of some 10,000 Jews have been carried off to Babylon over there. And there were circumstances over there beginning to prevail that led Jeremiah to feel he really needed, or not really, God felt at the time for Jeremiah to write a letter to those people to tell them something very important. And it's important because what he is telling them, he's also telling the people in Jerusalem about what's coming down the hill at them. So anyway, the time has come for him to write this letter to these people after Jeconiah, the king, the queen, the eunuchs, the princes, and all the carpenters and smiths, every craftsman was carried away by the hand of Elisha, the son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah. These are people he sent over there to take the letter to these people, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all that are carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away captive from Jerusalem to Babylon. That's what I got to say for you. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat the fruit of them. Take wives and beget sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. Give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. We're going to have a generation or two here. You get what we're doing? I want you to get married. I want you to have children. Then I want your children to have children. Settle down. Plant gardens. Build houses. He says then, I want you to do this, that you may be increased there and not diminished. You are over here in Babylon. I don't want you to disappear as a people. I want you to grow and to increase. Now what is interesting about this, and it falls strangely on the ears when you think about captivity, is that these people, having been uprooted and moved away from their homeland, still had a life. Something that you would think was I'm sure it was a terrible thing to happen to them. Captivity is a very bad thing, and being uprooted from your home and carried away is a very bad thing. But it doesn't mean the end of life. This is what God is telling them. Your life's not over. Build a house. Plant a garden. Get married. Have kids. Get on with life. In a way, it's like saying, play the hand you've been dealt, my friend. Don't wish you had something better. Don't wish you had something different. Do the best you can where you are with what you got. He said, another thing which I think is fascinating, seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof you shall have peace. Now, I can't think of very many names more maligned in the Bible than Babylon. And here's a prophet, under God's instructions, wrote a letter to these people who are living in Babylon. It says, I want you to pray for the peace of this city. Because in the peace of this city, you will have peace. The government of Babylon was strong. People had rights. They could walk the streets in safety. People weren't coming in the windows of their house at night and killing people or carrying off stuff. Babylon had a strong government at this time. I can only conclude that. And so God says, seek the peace of Babylon. Don't do anything else. This runs counter to the impulse from autonomy. The Israelites had freedom to live a good life in Babylon. One of their own was high in government. You didn't know that, didn't you? His name was Daniel. High up in government. Very respected in Babylon at this time. Now, this is a warning to settle down and not rebel. And when you read between the lines, you begin to understand what's happening here. There was a revolution in the making, both in Jerusalem and in Babylon. There were people who were, for whatever motives and whatever reasons they may have had, who were communicating with each other across all these distances. That's why Jeremiah needed to write the letter to these people and tell them to settle down. is because there were individuals who were fomenting rebellion in these countries, and those rebellions would have led to great loss of life, more than any of them imagined. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, don't let your prophets and your diviners that be in the midst of you deceive you. Don't listen to your dreams which you cause to be dreamed. They prophesy falsely unto you in my name. I have not sent them, saith the Lord. What's going on? Well, in Babylon and in Jerusalem, you got people standing up and saying, now the Lord sent me with a message to you, brother. And the Lord has told me that we need to throw off the Babylonian yoke and we need to be free again, and giving this whole big speech of everything. And, of course, it appealed to people. People always want to go home. People are always hearkening back to the place where they were born, to their roots. And to say that God wants us to go back, that God will be with us if we go back, that God will help us all throw off the yoke of King of Babylon, they were telling them this. Why were they doing this? We know it was a lie. You know, we're reading the Bible. The Bible tells us categorically it was a lie. We know by the outcome it was a lie. But why were they doing this? About the only reason I can think of it is power. That's the only possible reason. For thus saith the Lord. And here comes the real stunner, I'm sure, for people living over there. I know Daniel spent some time fasting and praying and trying to get his mind around it. And his heavy prayer of Daniel 9, when he prays about this, comes out of his realization of what this all means. Thus saith the Lord, after 70 years are accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word toward you in causing you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end, which means basically to give you the end that you hoped for. But it's going to be 70 years. Now that probably was depressing to anybody who's 50 years old at the time. You know, 70 years, my children and grandchildren will be going back. And yet, if you could realize, or if you could just think your way through it and think, well, here I am. I'm by the waters of Babylon. The Euphrates is here. The Tigris is here. We can grow crops here. There is water here. We can build houses. We can live our lives here. I can see my children. I can see my grandchildren here. And just settle down and live your life. It wasn't that bad, was it? But there were people telling him, oh, this is awful. This is terrible. We can't do this. But God says, folks, you need to understand what I'm doing. I'm doing this so I can do you good at your latter end, to give you what you really hope for. Captivity is not an altogether bad thing. That's the thing that suddenly comes out of this, and you don't really realize it, until you stop and think about what you're dealing with. It was God's way of solving Israel's problems that had gotten out of Israel's control. The whole thing was beyond them. They couldn't deal with it any longer. The way God uses his terminology is, he said, the land is so full of innocent blood, all tables are full of vomit and filthiness, there's no place clean. You can't even find a clean place to put your foot down in this country anymore. His solution? Get them out of there. Let the land lie fallow for 70 years and be cleansed by the rains that fall upon it, and finally enjoy her Sabbaths, and then come back to the land. That was God's solution. Get them out of there. Righteous people could live safely in Babylon, while at home they would have been devoured by nasty, wicked rulers. If you had anything, they'd try to take it away from you. All things work together for good. Even the bad things that happen can turn out for our good if God is on our side. And here we find that the captivity of Israel was actually, at the very least we can say, the lesser of the evils that Jerusalem faced. And another way of looking at it, it was a greater good. He said, then you shall call upon me, and you shall go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you shall seek me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart. And when I read that, I suddenly realized an astonishing thing. Israel found God in Babylon. They finally settled down. They finally got their heads clear. They finally humbled themselves and prayed and sought God with their entire heart, and they found him. And where were they? In Babylon. You may not realize this, but there was a flourishing Jewish community in Babylon all the way up until the time when Jesus Christ was born. Very strong Jewish community there. A lot of people came back. They established the country again, but a lot of them stayed in Babylon. And you've heard of the Babylonian Talmud. Well, this was a very late development. in Judaism, but it developed in Babylon from the Jewish community, a very high-level scholarly community of Jews in Babylon at the time. So they returned to God in Babylon, and they returned having learned some very bitter lessons, because the Jews came back determined to build a fence around the law, determined not to disobey God. They had learned their lesson about the Sabbath. They had learned their lesson about a lot of stuff. And there's no time after this period of time. You find all over the archaeological digs in Jerusalem, you find idols everywhere. But you don't find idols from this time when in Israelite communities, when they came back from Babylon until the time Jesus comes on the scene. Some things got cleaned out as a result of this happening. God says, I will be found by you. I'll turn away your captivity. I will gather you from the nations where I have driven you, and I will bring you again to the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive. Because you have said, this is serious business. Somebody has said, well, the Lord has raised us up prophets in Babylon. Know that thus saith the Lord of the king that sits upon the throne of David, and of all the people that dwell in this city, Jerusalem, and of your brethren that didn't go forth with you into captivity. You want to think about what's happening back here? Thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, I will send upon them the sword, famine, pestilence. I will make them like vile figs that can't be eaten. They are so rotten. And I will persecute them with the sword, the famine, the pestilence. I will deliver them to be removed to all the kingdoms of the earth. To be a curse, an astonishment, a hissing, and a reproach among all the nations where I have driven them. Why am I going to do this, God said? Because they wouldn't listen to my words, saying, saith the Lord, which I sent by my servants the prophets, getting up early and send them. I told them again and again, but they would not hear, saith the Lord. It's almost as though God took the people from Jerusalem that he wanted to keep and moved them to Babylon. And he took this dregs that got left behind, who really would not hear and who would not respond, and destroyed them. Counted them up, picked them all up, moved them all out, and then just let the land lie there, enjoying her Sabbaths for 70 long years. That seems to be what happened. Then he could bring back to Jerusalem again the people who had found him in Babylon. Hear the word of the Lord, all ye of the captivity, whom I have sent from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, of Ahab and Zedekiah. These are not the kings Ahab and Zedekiah. These are two prophets who prophesy a lie unto you in my name. Behold, I will deliver them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He'll kill them in front of your very eyes. Woo! You realize what's going on. These are two rebels. They are rabble-rousers. They are trying to foment rebellion against King Nebuchadnezzar. He says, I'm going to turn them over to Nebuchadnezzar, and you'll see what he does. They're named. Their plotting will be discovered. They will be killed. And of them shall be taken up a curse by everybody in the captivity in Babylon, saying, the Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab. This is a curse, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire, because they committed villainy in Israel, have committed adultery with their neighbors' wives, have spoken lying words in my name, which I had not commanded them. Even I know and am a witness, saith the Lord. I don't know what it is about false prophets and adultery. But you see, they seem to be just go together like horse and carriage or something of that nature. I can't find a good metaphor right now. But you just find it again and again. Jeremiah just, calls a spade a spade. Thus shall you also speak to Shemaiah the Nehemite, saying, Shemaiah, got a new one here. This, I believe, is in Jerusalem. Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, because you have sent letters in your name. No, he's in Babylon, I'm sorry. You have sent letters in your name to all the people at Jerusalem, to Zephaniah, the son of Messiah the priest, and all the priests saying. Now, here is the substance of his letter, which seems to come back in response to Jeremiah's letter. He claimed that God made him a priest instead of Jehoiada. He said, you should take all these mad prophets, and by that he means Micaiah and Jeremiah, who was telling the truth, and put them in prison and stocks. He says, why haven't you dealt with Jeremiah, who's making himself to be a prophet? He is saying the captivity should be long and you should accept it. It's not true. Not what God showed me to do. And he says, have Zephaniah read this letter in the ears of Jeremiah. Now, this is a very bold move on his part. Jeremiah writes the letter over, and he writes back and says, who does Jeremiah think he is? You people deal with him. And they did attempt, by the way, to deal with Jeremiah. The story is told in later chapters. But this is entirely political, because these men are trying to establish themselves in some area, some means of power over these people over there. What they hope to do, how they expected to accomplish it, I have no idea. Not with the king of Babylon in power. But it's what he tried. The result, verse 30, then came the word of the Lord to Jeremiah, saying, send to all them of the captivity, saying, thus saith the Lord concerning Shemaiah, because he has prophesied to you, and I didn't send him, and caused you to trust in a lie. Therefore saith the Lord, I will punish him and his seed. He shall not have a man to dwell among this people, neither shall he behold the good that I will do for my people, because he has taught rebellion against the Lord. Now, in a sense, what really I think the thing that dawned on me when I read this 29th chapter and considered this exchange of letters, the political situation that was in existence at the time, was a growing realization that the captivity of Israel was the best thing that could have happened to them. And I don't know that I'd really thought of it quite that way before. You know, you always think, well, you're better off living in your own land. Well, yes, if you repent and turn to God, if you clean up your act, if you straighten up and fly right, if you don't shed innocent blood, if you avenge the innocent who are killed in your place, if you actually stand up for what is right, yeah, it's a good thing to be in your homeland. But if you don't, your homeland can become desolate. It can become so corrupt that you can't find a place to put your foot that will not render you unclean because of the blood of innocent people. So, maybe the captivity of Israel was not such a bad thing. Somehow, I don't think people realize it was the alternative to something much worse. And it underlines a scripture familiar to us all and that we lean on from time to time. Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose.